If you're familiar with me and my channel, League of Legends is the last thing you'd expect to see. I've heard a lot of negative things about it, so I decided to try it out for myself to see if these claims are valid. And after casually playing for over 8 months, my overall opinion of LoL is that I don't recommend you play it alone. Stick to Team Fortress 2 or Gary's mod. There are some smaller elements of gameplay in its history which I find really interesting, but the cons heavily outweigh the pros, and the issues with LoL are baked into its design. The topic of this video, however, concerns a small part of LoL that I really admire, and believe makes for an interesting discussion about questionable balance changes, community perception, and game design. For my TF2 audience, I know you can relate to this, so if you don't care about LoL, but would like to hear about balance gone wrong, this video might interest you. For any LoL players watching, this video concerns Yorick and his rework or Midscope from patch 2.5.07 from April 2nd of 2025. An update which had both positive and negative changes for the champion, but overall came to be received poorly by both Yorick players and the broader community. For Yorick players in particular, there's been a lot of misinformation recently about how the champion was changed and how he was prior to the April update. So in this video, I aim to put everyone on the same page about what exactly changed, why changes were made, and what can be done. If you know a lot about Yorick already, you can expect a lot of obvious information, which I want to include to educate a wider audience. I'll briefly cover what Yorick does and the numbers before his rework as of his 2.5.06 version from March 19th of 2025. This may seem unnecessary, but it has been over a year since he was changed, and a lot of players who have been absent from LoL might not know what's different. Yorick's passive spawns a grave for every enemy unit killed with his Q, for every enemy champion or large monster that die near him, and after a set amount of enemy units die near him. Mistwalkers can spawn from graves. Yorick's Q empowers his next auto attack to deal bonus damage and heal him for a percentage of his missing health. Recasting while on cooldown will spawn Mistwalkers from each grave. Yorick's W spawns a ring-shaped wall which lasts for 4 seconds and can be broken with auto attacks. Yorick's E throws a projectile which deals a percentage of the target's current health, slows, and marks the target as cursed. Cursed targets continuously spawn Mistwalkers from nearby graves, causing them to leap to the target. They also take bonus damage from the next 8 Mistwalker attacks and grant Yorick and his pets bonus move speed toward cursed targets. Yorick's R spawns the Maiden of the Mist, which upon attacking a target marks them with Touch of the Maiden. This mark can be consumed by Yorick's auto attacks or his E to damage the target for a small percentage of their maximum health. The Maiden can also instantly spawn Mistwalkers, and R can be recast to send the Maiden down the nearest lane. A simple kit all things considered. Yorick after the rework received some further changes over the next few patches, so I'll be comparing his pre-rework version to his 2.5.13 version from June 25th of 2025, where he hasn't received any major changes since. Yorick's base armor and armor growth has been nerfed. Yorick's passive also spawns a grave for every enemy champion or large monster hit by his Q, and the number of enemies required to die near him to spawn a grave has been reduced. Mistwalkers now scale with Yorick's bonus AD and bonus health, received buffed a base AD and health, received nerfed attack speed, take reduced AoE damage increasing with level over its pre-change amount, take reduced damage from minions and full damage from all monsters, deal less damage to monsters, and receive increased damage from melee auto attacks. Yorick's Q received less cooldown, a buff to its AD scaling, a buff to the percentage of missing health healed, and a nerf to its base damage. Yorick's W received no changes. Yorick's E slow duration was nerfed and now deals a percentage of the target's maximum health with buffed AP scaling. Its damage cap against monsters was nerfed and it now has a minimum damage threshold against minions. Cursed targets receive armor reduction and grant a greater move speed bonus, increasing with level over its pre-change amount. Yorick's R now scales with Yorick's bonus AD and bonus health, received buffed base AD and health, and received a nerfed monster damage cap. Yorick's power budget has shifted from his pets to Yorick himself. This is evident by the changes made to his passive and Q. The buff to the total AD ratio and healing give Yorick damage and sustain even if he doesn't have any ghouls in a fight. The healing is especially useful as when it's maxed, healing for 10% of your missing health can make a difference when fights get close. Spawning a grave for hitting a champion or large monster enables a new loop during fights. For pre-change Yorick, if you lose your pets while fighting, there's no reliable way to get them back, unless you're near minions or monsters. Using your Q and then E to summon Mistwalkers means you always have access to them, so long as you can lane both abilities. This is also useful for clearing camps early on when you don't have access to the Maiden. His E also reflects changes made to move damage away from his pets and to Yorick more broadly. Instead of a flat damage bonus exclusively for them, Armor Shred lets both Yorick and his pets benefit from laning E for a flat period of time. Your team can also benefit from the Armor Shred as well. The slow nerf means Mistwalkers will stick to the targets less, with the cursed bonus move speed buff encouraging Yorick to close the gap. Yorick's pet changes have made them future-proof for whenever he receives new balance changes. By making them scale off of bonus AD and bonus health, this separates Yorick's ratios from his pets' ratios. Before, his pets would scale off of Yorick's total AD and maximum health, meaning that if you change Yorick's AD or health, His pets will also be changed, which might lead to unintended consequences. Separating the ratios ensures that his pets can be tweaked independently to Yorick himself. Mistwalkers have received a lot of quality of life changes which you won't be able to spot at first. Previously, Mistwalkers would correctly receive damage from sources like minions, monsters, and some champion abilities. But auto attacks and champion single target abilities would one-shot them regardless of how much health they had. So while your pets might have near 1000 health, they would still die to any auto attack from any champion. Mistwalkers receive damage differently now. They have real health bars with melee champions dealing bonus damage to them. The AoE damage resistance was also buffed. This is useful for some bad matchups and allows pets to stay in fights for longer by tanking more AoE damage. Mistwalkers now have damage resistance against minions, which allows them to survive in lane for longer. To compensate for all of this, the damage of Yorick's pets and his E have been tweaked because of changes made to their scaling. Pet ratios moving from total to bonus means their base stats needed adjustment to compensate. They've been evened out with pets dealing less damage overall as a nerf, including an attack speed nerf to Mistwalkers. You'll be seeing Mistwalkers more often because of Yorick's passive and Q changes, with each Mistwalker individually having less strength. This also extends to changes in the jungle, with E receiving a damage cap nerf against monsters, Mistwalkers receiving full damage from monsters while dealing less damage to them, and the Maiden having a nerf damage cap against monsters. This serves to encourage Yorick to remain with his pets while they clear camps instead of letting them work independently, but comes off as a nerf to his clear overall. So with the rework, Yorick is more independent by himself, his E now benefits him and his team more broadly, his pets are now future-proofed for new changes, Mistwalkers now receive damage correctly, and overall number changes make Yorick and his Q stronger, while his pets and E are weaker, including changes against monsters. Now that you know what has changed, we can ask ourselves why. Our best resource for insight comes from Phreak and his video covering Yorick's 2.5.07 changes one by one. He was also the developer that originally started the Yorick Rework project. If you'd like even more context as to why these changes were made, I highly encourage you to watch Phreak's video. If you don't feel like it, the broader goals for his changes can be boiled down to these topics. We've already discussed a few of these like more, weaker Mistwalkers, and Yorick's self-reliance with his passive and Q changes, as well as future-proof pet calculations with changes made to his passive and R. That leaves us with these 4 goals left to discuss. Around the time before the rework, Yorick had really high win rates in low MMR solo queue, so much so that he had to be tuned toward a degree of unviability, as Phreak put it himself, much to the disapproval of high MMR players. The changes also aim to make Yorick more competent in high MMR, whereas counterplay is much more common knowledge and accessible. The adjustments to his level 1 and 6, early game, and late game reflect these sentiments too. Yorick's kit is exceptional for dueling and split pushing, so it makes sense then that he is a weak team fighter. He doesn't have any hard CC, conventional gap closing tools, and his pets are susceptible to being picked off. One of the goals of the rework was to improve Yorick's team fighting potential, which can be seen with the changes made to his passive, Q, and E. The E changes make the most sense. Despite the nerf to slow duration, the armor shred can greatly benefit your team's damage, especially if you hit multiple targets. The passive and Q changes meanwhile don't improve team fighting as much. Putting yourself in a position where you can land your Q means you'll need to frontline, but without a stronger tool to help your team engage or sustain yourself, your impact on team fights is inconsistent. Changing Yorick to be more compatible with team fights is admirable, when you could easily dismiss it and just choose another champion instead. In saying that, Phreak has acknowledged that team fighting is only mildly improved with the rework, not by a lot, mostly because of Yorick's unique kit. Although in smaller skirmishes with 1 to 3 combatants on each team, all of the aforementioned changes are quite useful for securing kills and contesting minor objectives. Modernizing Yorick's kit involves bending some of the rules around how he works as a champion, in particular his Graves and Mistwalkers. E moving to Armor Shred is easier to utilize and benefits more than just pets. Mistwalkers doing extra damage for the next 8 attacks is bizarre. The passive changes regarding Graves spawning from enemy deaths plus hitting champions and the changes made to Mistwalker health serve to give Yorick more opportunities to use his pets. Previously, if you wanted to get your pets up, you had to dig Graves primarily in lane or in the jungle, which meant Yorick had limited spaces to regroup his army. With the changes, you now have even more access to them simply by queuing any valid target, but coupled with the damage and attack speed nerfs to Mistwalkers, it seems to work against itself. The changes make it so Mistwalkers remain in fights for longer, but their overall impact is reduced per fight. They went from being slightly tedious to maintain for a greater reward to easier to access for less reward. There has been some confusion about how hitting someone with a shovel instantly digs a grave, but it's just a direction that was chosen to make graves more accessible, which could be seen as modernizing. Finally, improving Yorick's early game, in particular level 1 to 6, and nerfing his late game ties into fixing MMR skew, but serves its own purpose. Pre-change Yorick's early levels were weaker than most champions, as his early damage came from both his Q and digging graves before trading. His level 6 is a huge power spike, as the Maiden lets you constantly spawn Mistwalkers, as well as give Yorick a consistent stream of damage. Yorick would then be countered in his early levels by lane bullies and denying him access to waves so he can't dig graves, heal with his Q, or receive experience to reach 6. The rework makes his early game stronger thanks to the passive and Q changes. Now it'll take less enemies to spawn graves, and his Q not only spawns graves for hitting champions, but the damage and healing adds up over time. To even this out, his damage output was nerfed in the late game, with Mistwalkers being explicitly worse than pre-rework. Those are the primary reasons cited by Phreak for why Yorick would be changed, but during the time before the rework, Yorick was being played in two ways which many believe contributed to kickstarting the rework in the first place. Lethality was an extremely popular way to play Yorick and a viable alternative to bruiser builds. Instead of fighting up close, you play around poking your opponents and let your pets deal most of the damage before finishing targets off yourself. This playstyle was very risk-reward as you weren't building health or resistances. You were vulnerable to being bursted the same way you could burst targets yourself. You were also still able to put pressure on the map and take towers fast because of how lethality and armor penetration interact with structures. Conversely, playing this way was despised by a lot of players. Yorick being afforded opportunities to score takedowns by landing one skill shot was low risk, high reward, and had little counterplay. Lethality and the playstyle promoted for Yorick was seen as problematic and a large departure from the type of champion he was supposed to be. In response to low MMR performance, his pets received a nerf before the rework in patch 14.21 from October 23rd of 2024, before later being nerfed hard with the rework itself. Today, lethality builds can still be ran, but are nowhere near as effective or rewarding compared to before the rework. Playing Yorick in the jungle wasn't as popular as top, but still proved to be effective with its own unique learning curve. Yorick could use his Mistwalkers to clear camps while he moved around the map himself, allowing him to set up early ganks and contest Scuttle without losing out on anything. He was also proficient at invading, stealing camps with his pets, and you could even learn obscure tech to summon more than the average amount of pets to take objectives by themselves. Yorick in this state was overperforming as a jungler. Being able to cover ground while clearing, invading, or taking objectives with minimal input involved was seen as problematic. Coupled with lethality builds which let you take camps even faster, plus his pre-existing strengths in causing map pressure, and it's no surprise that he was getting nerfed. The first of these changes were nerfs to the Maiden's damage cap against monsters and ease monster damage. Then came the rework and some additional patches after, which adjusted pet damage output against monsters. These changes were made retroactively to bounce out his win rate to an acceptable level, while a more thought out and elegant solution wasn't considered. And so his jungle presence was nerfed pretty hard, with his unique approach to clearing being heavily diminished instead of tweaked. Most interestingly, a few months after the rework with patch 25.23 from November 19th of 2025, a lot of champions received changes that would make them competent in the jungle, including champions which occupy a similar role to Yorick. Some of them now see regular play in the jungle while others don't. These changes were of course made independently to Yorick, but it's unfortunate that his jungle presence was seen as problematic, while other similar champions were given the opportunity to be played in multiple roles. I highly encourage you to watch NineTails' video addressing the impact the rework had on jungle Yorick for further information, which would be too long-winded to repeat here. Following the changes, the overall response on the rework was mixed, leaning on negative. The range of opinions and complaints circled back on key issues like Mistwalker nerfs, too much reliance on Q, consideration for teamfights going against Yorick's purpose, boring for both sides, less skill expression, and build plus role variety was weakened. Overall, the feedback was that he got dumbed down to just another bruiser or juggernaut, in which there are champions who occupy the same role and even outperform him in the areas his rework were intended to improve him in. This also caused some prominent Yorick content creators to drop the champion or LoL entirely, which hasn't helped shape his image. As for the broader LoL community, the rework was disliked. Yorick as a champion has always had a bad reputation, and the rework didn't improve it, but rather gave players something new to hate. There are some goals and changes made which Yorick players do appreciate, like the improvements to team fighting and Mistwalker survivability, but are conversely disliked by the rest of the community. Today, there are players complaining about the rework, but in ways which are incorrect or spread misinformation about the changes and why they were made. Most of these claims are made out of frustration or anger, so they warrant some dispelling. A common one is Mistwalkers deal no damage. The damage output got nerfed, but claiming they deal no damage simply isn't true. In extended trades, Mistwalkers could whittle down your opponent's health without you even realizing it, and straight E's are good at harassing opponents while you do something else, thanks to Mistwalker health changes. The idea that Yorick's pets should be able to tear through opponents is a power fantasy. Lethality pushed Mistwalkers to the limit, but ultimately they were problematic and unfun in the eyes of many. A common sentiment about Yorick is that he has no counterplay, and this rang true for Lethality. Being able to burst down an opponent from afar doesn't take much skill, and had minimal interaction or room for counterplay. Interactions like these are why Lethality was seen as problematic, and although players now dislike Mistwalkers for other reasons, they're much more manageable to play against. In return for the nerfs, we now have Mistwalkers with high durability that can be used in various unique ways if you know how to manipulate them. Their damage has taken a hit, but they're not useless and serve to deal both damage and act as a utility option for Yorick. Build variety is another common complaint that Yorick players bring up, with one item in particular being propped up as a requirement to perform well. Trinity Force is incredibly strong for various reasons on Yorick. It complements his Q for scoring takedowns, destroying structures, and digging graves. It's good, yes, but you don't have to build it every game to perform well. neither do you have to abstain from building it altogether. Build variety on Yorick is still present. You have a variety of item and rune combinations that can serve you well, but those choices alone are just two of many moving parts in the average lore match. Your success does not hinge on them alone, but some players instead choose to ignore them in favor of treading down the path of least resistance and complaining. In saying that, I do sympathize with these opinions, but I believe a more accurate way to put it is this. Attempting build variety on Yorick is not rewarded with as much success compared to building items like Triforce, and the reasons for that are rooted in how the rework balanced Yorick's power budget. The direction he was taken in made a lot of previously viable and fun builds perform poorly, while also limiting role diversity. If build variety is to return, his power budget needs to be re-evaluated. Finally, Yorick is commonly cited as being useless, which is in reference to his performance after laning phase, during mid-game and late game. There is some truth to this, as Phreak explicitly stated in his video that Yorick doesn't scale as well as he used to, as a trade-off for his improved early game, but saying that he's outright useless isn't true. Yorick is still competent when it comes to playing his part. Your strengths lie in split pushing and creating map pressure for your team instead of more direct plays like securing kills and team fighting. The longer the game goes on, you'll have less structures to take and opponents will be more competent at answering to you. So unfortunately he does scale worse than pre-rework, but he's not useless. Again, there is some validity here as parts of his kit which encourage split pushing like R recast failed to have the same impact they once had. Not to mention there's players who would prefer having a worse early game if it means they can scale better later, as Yorick used to be. That covers the basics of how Yorick has changed and what he's been through for the past year or so. Again, I highly encourage you to watch Phreak's and NineTails videos concerning the rework for further information. With all that out of the way, I'd like to briefly bring up some of the events that transpired during the development of the rework. In Phreak's video, he states that the rework is not perfect and a lot of work remains to be done. Due to time constraints and other projects, Yorick wasn't given the time or attention he deserved. The rework was unfinished, but shipped to live regardless. Coupled with this, the Yorick players that were involved with the project were only there for feedback and suggestions of their own weren't considered. Initially, there was some cooperation between Riot and Yorick players. Long before the rework, his queue received a change in patch 1.4.3 from February 7th of 2024, which made it heal based off of his missing health and consequently scaled off of how much health he had. This was tailored toward his bruiser nature, and it was a suggestion which came from prominent Yorick player Camp Psycho, who actively raised awareness on issues with Yorick and strive for change. This wouldn't go unnoticed by Rioters, as the queue change was officially implemented by Riot Flux in said patch. A year later, Camp Psycho was reached out to by Riot Aethic for feedback on the rework, but because of how differently he plays Yorick with more tank-oriented builds, he decided it was better to have more than one source voice the input to avoid bias. And so some notable content creators and rank 1s from LAN and LAS were invited to join the Yorick Council, as it's been referred to, a group of players who would be involved with the rework's development. As we've come to learn from NineTails' video, their involvement was little more than providing feedback about changes which were already planned internally, with new suggestions from the council explicitly not being heard out. Some agreements may have been reached, like W not being changed, but overall the developers working on the project stayed their hand about what they were already going to do. Skewing Yorick away from low MMR and fixing Mistwalker accessibility were key issues that most of the council had opinions and suggestions on, but ultimately Riot went with what they thought was best and consequently his scaling has suffered as a result. For Yorick Jungle in particular, the rework was a huge blow, as it was mildly popular before the rework and blew up after the changes had dropped. NineTails, a veteran Yorick Jungle player of 10 years, had offered suggestions and changes about how to balance out his jungle presence and keep it viable. Instead, they did their own thing, and all the hotfix changes post-rework were made to balance out the win rate instead of reach a concrete solution, the slow nerf on E being one of these band-aids. So Yorick was reworked without the inherent support of prominent Yorick players, and he remains in a state where there's a lot to be done. In NineTails' video about the rework, he states that Riot is aware of what changes Yorick players want, like reprioritizing pets, but aren't promising meaningful work on him anytime soon. The rework was done in good faith, as his performance in the jungle was too strong and other parts of his kit needed cleaning up, but the execution and result left him in a really bad state. Yorick needs to be changed, but it's a matter of when, and it's out of our control. This information was from more than a year ago, so what now? From my roots, the TF2 community has had some success openly discussing, campaigning, or writing for change about issues the game has faced. To take a page out of our book, if you want Yorick to be changed, talk about it. Write a post or record a video about why you don't like him, as I and many others have. If you don't like Yorick, don't play him, and do what you can to incite change. In our eyes, he's probably Riot's lowest priority, but that doesn't mean you should remain complacent, and I don't think a champion like him should remain in the state he's in right now. When you give up and stop talking, nothing will change. So, what should change about Yorick then? It's subjective, but everyone can see the issues he currently faces and the common goal of returning him to a minion mentor being a top priority. If it were up to me, this is what I have to say. If you don't care about my suggestions, skip to the timestamp for the conclusion. There's some good in the rework, but a lot of bad too. Perhaps some things could have been approached in a different way or reverted altogether. Promoting more Mistwalkers and revolving his passive and damage around his Q has proven not interesting or fun. His loop of digging graves is brilliant. For early game situations, which is why passive changes were made, you should decide whether you want to use your Q to dig a grave for a stronger trade later on, or Q your opponent for immediate damage at the cost of not digging a grave. They're a resource to consider as Mistwalkers should make a difference in fights and around the map. Right now, having easy access to them diminishes their individual strength and makes their utility not as impactful, affecting Yorick's total impact. Reducing the enemies required to die for passive graves to spawn is nice, but I believe needing to consciously dig my own should be a requirement if it means my Mistwalkers are stronger. A few things could be done here. Maybe the enemies required to spawn a grave should be bumped back up to a higher amount, but landing Q on valid targets like champions and monsters will reduce the amount required by a little. This could reward Yorick choosing not to dig a grave with immediate damage, while contributing toward getting his next passive grave. This is unlike Q today, which spawns graves for free. There's no thought or cost analysis on what you hit Q with, you get rewarded no matter what. The Q changes also serve to make Mistwalkers more present in teamfights. If that's a priority, why not extend the valid targets for leaving a grave to allied units as well? At most, this leaves 9 potential Mistwalkers to be summoned over the course of a fight, and other small skirmishes which could make a difference. Overall, the desire to make Mistwalkers more accessible is strange, as Yorick previously didn't struggle that much to get them pre-level 6, and they become abundant when the main is up. Q spawning graves on hitting valid targets I think isn't healthy for the champion, and should be removed in favor of a solution which makes accessing them require more thought. All of Yorick's pets need to be prioritized as an essential part of his kit again. The changes made to their ratios and health are very welcome, so what remains to be done is tweak the numbers. For Mistwalkers, the bonus AD ratio should be increased, but I think the attack speed nerf is overlooked as it can hinder how much damage they do, and there's some fringe situations like Mistwalkers failing to hit moving targets, which might be alleviated with said buff. There's also situations where pets can stop chasing targets out of vision, which robs Yorick of a lot of value. A vision buff to Mistwalkers could alleviate this. Some alternate approaches to durability could also be considered, like Mistwalkers having armor and magic resistance, while also scaling with Yorick's bonus armor and MR. This might resolve needing to have explicit resistances against minion, monster, and AoE damage, or at least reduce their reliance on it. Many players today are frustrated by how much effort it takes to kill Mistwalkers, so I think the previous bonus damage from melee auto attacks should be extended to the entire cast to reduce frustration while being toned back slightly. Yorick's Q receiving less cooldown is appreciated as it helps him dig graves faster, and the healing changes can make a huge difference in fights, allowing him to survive some really close situations. Thematically, it complements his grasping at the last remnants of life thing he has going on by healing off of his missing health. It also lets him sustain in side lanes for longer and encourage split pushing behavior. Q's issues right now are its damage and scaling. Even with the hotfix nerf, it's still his strongest tool and not in a way which is fun or engaging. Its damage shouldn't be nerfed to the ground, but rather be able to output an equal amount of damage to what Mistwalkers could do if they are buffed. Maybe Q could trade its sheer damage in return for keeping its utility features, seeing as how useful the healing is and the way it already interacts with Yorick's kit. Additionally, buffing the base damage and nerfing its scaling may improve Yorick's early game without making it a requirement to build around. Yorick's W and E are fine really. W probably has the most skill expression in his entire kit at the moment, and it's the one thing which neither Riot or the Yorick players wanted to change. E causing armor shred is welcome as it increases Yorick's overall damage output instead of just benefiting his pets. The slow nerf however was a hotfix, and remains unwarranted. It could be reverted to help close the gap between targets alongside the move speed buff, which were both in effect until a hotfix from April 4th of 2025. Yorick's R still has great synergy with Yorick himself, but the maiden faces similar issues to Mistwalkers right now, where by herself she can't put much pressure on the map as she used to. This is because of her scaling changes and an overall nerf to both her damage and Mistwalker damage, making R recast not as impactful at creating map pressure. Again, the numbers could be tweaked to favor her damage and health again, while using the separated ratios or even benefiting from armor and MR, giving Yorick more agency when it comes to split pushing and map pressure. Outside of alternate rework changes, I would also like to see an improvement to Yorick's build variety with new scalings and tweaked ratios introduced alongside reverts concerning his passive and Q. Yorick has always had two schools of thought. The undead juggernaut or bruiser crowd, who fights up close among the ranks of the undead with high durability and build paths containing fighter or tank items. And the necromancer fantasy or AD mage crowd, who commands the army of the undead from the shadows with less durability and build paths containing lethality or mage items. Historically, balancing Yorick to lean too heavily into one playstyle or the other has caused friction among the player base and broader community, like with the Rework's Q reliance being too boring and the lethality builds of old being too problematic. What if you had a choice to play as either a bruiser or AD mage instead of Yorick being explicitly balanced around either class? The simplest approach to this idea, I believe, is introducing new scaling ratios to Yorick's pet damage and durability alongside their existing ratios. The premise of this idea goes as follows. If you want to build Yorick as a bruiser, building health, armor, or MI would benefit you and your pet's durability. And building AD would benefit your damage, Q's damage, and your pet's damage. Like today and in the past, this would allow Yorick to play as a bruiser by improving the damage of his Q, while pets have greater durability for fighting and deal sustained damage over time. On the opposite end, if you want to build Yorick as an AD mage or minion mancer, building health, armor, or MR is still beneficial, but instead of building lethality to maximize pet damage, you instead build AP, with your pet's AD scaling off of an AD and AP ratio, much like how the maiden already scales off of AD despite dealing magic damage. This could allow for Yorick to play more on the backline while still improving his pet's damage and durability, also allowing him to benefit off of the item effects of AP items. Even today, some are popular like Leandries and Rylai's. This change could see Yorick perform well not only in top with a variety of playstyles, but also in mid, either playing around his Q and survivability or E and spacing. Overall, there are a lot of things I haven't considered, like the following. I just think it would be fun above all else. If something like this is unrealistic, then perhaps a rune or item could be introduced which benefits pet's damage the same way we have runes which benefit parts of other champions' kits. A budget minion Mensa augment as a keystone could be explored, or maybe an item in a similar vein to Shoujin's increased to ability damage, or Leandry's or Riftmaker's increased to all damage. This may also benefit other champions who want to create builds surrounding their pets and normalize the minion Mensa as its own class. Hullbreaker already exists which benefits Siege and Super Minions. Why not introduce something like it for pets? As for larger rework proposals, there's been a lot of ideas floating around the community which you can read up on in places like the Yorick subreddit. If you're up to me, I think elaborating on Yorick's unique attributes, map control, skill required, and skill expression should be a priority. Yorick is difficult to balance. He should be strong when he has his pets up, but not useless when he doesn't. He was designed to be a bruiser, but over the years players have had success running him as an AD mage. There needs to be a fine distribution of damage across all of his kit. He shouldn't rely on only his Q or his pets for damage, but use both in tandem. For example, the Maiden doesn't just push waves and drain targets. She lets Yorick deal consistent max health damage which is best utilized when constantly applied through auto-attacking. This would be strange for a champion whose primary source of damage is abilities like pets, but for Yorick he can afford to get up close and deal damage with his Q, which complements the Maiden's touch perfectly. But when you place too much importance on his Q for triggering his passive, dealing damage and sustain, the rest of his kit needs to be slightly worse to compensate. And for a champion whose identity revolves around being a grave digger commanding an army of the undead, why should most of that strength be put into his shovel? A power budget balance needs to be struck as a baseline for his kit, with build variety impacting how strong either side is. But equally as important, I think emphasizing one of Yorick's most defining features, map pressure, is needed. With his kit, he can melt towers with Q and extend his siege time with his pets and W. He can push each lane by sending his pets down to it and pushing the last himself. His pets can briefly provide vision of the map and camps. He can proxy without needing to remain in the enemy's lane. His pets can set up freezes or push waves while recalling, and historically his skill lets him move around freely to influence more of the map. With so much potential to influence the map from afar, why shouldn't he be balanced around that as one of his key strengths? We already have a plethora of champions who are sufficiently lethal when it comes to bruising and team fighting. Why inch Yorick toward those roles instead of shaping his own identity? If taken to its logical extreme, perhaps Graves and Mistwalkers could be made much harder to access while having the improved survivability and utility of the rework with better damage. There have always been scenarios where you have ample access to Mistwalkers because of the Maiden, which combined with E often leads to frustration and annoyance from opponents playing against Yorick. Maybe by limiting their access, it'll make Yorick think more about where he sends them and how he uses them in trades. It also gives opponents some counterplay by anticipating a set number of pets instead of sudden bursts. Maybe Graves could only be dug under strict conditions like no longer spawning passively after an amount of enemy unit deaths, spawning only when last hitting with Q, after valid targets die including ally and enemy champions plus monsters, and after the Maiden assists with or kills an enemy unit. NineTails also proposed two interesting changes which I agree with, making E only cause active Mistwalkers to leap for the curse duration instead of constantly exhuming and leaping from all nearby graves, and only allowing Q and R recasts to spawn pets. These changes may serve to add a rhythm to how Yorick approaches trading, clearing, and fights, where you have Mistwalkers far less often, but the times you want them are telegraphed toward the opponent with the durability and strength of multiple Mistwalkers put together today. Perhaps E cast time could also be nerfed to require more skill and prediction, unlike today, where the rhythm of poking and trading is much more frantic. Also, in the eyes of many, Yorick doesn't have a real passive, and even in his original iteration, this was half true. I think if his Mistwalkers are treated with enough respect and power allocation, he shouldn't need a passive. But if you really wanted to, you could conjure up some fun ideas which revolve around his pets or the theme of death, including a bonus depending on how many Mistwalkers are on the map, a bonus depending on how many champions are dead, moving his current passive to Q in favor of a new passive, and so on. Overall, I don't have all the answers or know how these changes would affect other roles, what his weaknesses should be, and how it can be exploited across MMRs. Maybe my opinion is too fantastical or overloaded, but I think balancing out his power budget to include pets, re-emphasizing map pressure, and encouraging further skill expression by restricting pet accessibility to make them stronger should be a priority. The state Yorick is in right now is simply different. He is still a strong and competent champion who can perform well in his intended role. He isn't in need of buffs or nerfs, but rather the problem he faces is a matter of identity. Yorick's pets are a cool part of his kit and character. Their purpose has been explored in many different ways by the player base, and they should have as much importance as he does. The rework had succeeded in bringing Yorick close to his original vision as a bruiser, but failed in accommodating the variety of playstyles enjoyed by the community. The rework wasn't made by Phreak to torment you and spite the player base, but solved various problems the champion had with some really beneficial changes. Ultimately, the direction of the rework didn't consider the opinions of seasoned Yorick players, and the project was unfinished due to time constraints. So instead of bitching and blaming all of the players and developers involved, look to the future of what Yorick could become and speak your mind. I don't think we should be performing his last rites so soon.